I know that everybody has a different amount of space to work with when it comes to gardening, and most of us, even when we have a large area, wish that we had more because there are just so many fun fruits and vegetables to grow and so many things that we want to try out. So I'm going to talk about 4 approaches to saving space in the garden so that you can make the best use of the space that you have, and potentially, as your gardening prowess grows and as you start to explore new and different crops, you can grow more in a small space than you might be able to without these techniques. So the first one I want to mention is trellising. I'm standing here next to a simple bamboo trellis that we put up for some pole beans. And there are a lot of different crops that will climb up a trellis and utilize vertical space instead of spreading out over the ground and using horizontal space. So this frees up the space down on the ground to plant other kinds of crops. So beans are a great example. There are varieties of beans called bush beans that don't climb, and then there are varieties of beans called pole beans that will climb. So if you are working with limited space, it may make sense to choose the pole beans, build a trellis. You can even build a trellis out of string. It can be very simple and inexpensive, so that the beans can climb up and expand your garden into that vertical plane. Some other kinds of crops that are great to trellis are peas. Again, you're going to need to choose varieties that are climbing varieties and not bush types. And there are some kinds of zucchini, particularly the tromboncino is one that will climb. Also, there are varieties of gourds, and some kinds of melons will do a little bit of climbing. Cucumbers, their cousin, but not the same, will do many varieties of cucumbers, especially if they're not specified as a bush type, will also climb. So those are some of the common varieties that will climb up a trellis. Now, other kinds of plants like tomatoes can benefit from the support of a trellis and in that way grow vertically and free up the space underneath. So I think Natalie mentioned this in the intercropping lesson, but both of us tend to plant basil in between at the base of the tomato plants because the tomato plants grow up, so the basil can grow kind of in the understory of the tomatoes. That leads me to the second space-saving technique, which we already talked about in depth, and that's intercropping. So intercropping, as we've mentioned, is not a surefire thing where you just get 2 for 1 and you don't have to sacrifice anything. It definitely requires some planning and some thoughtfulness. But when you intercrop, you utilize that different space in your garden. You utilize the space that's freed up in the horizontal plane by letting things climb up into the vertical plane, and you can grow more different kinds of crops and more overall food in a given area if it's planned out well. So intercropping can be a great way, especially with short-lived things like green onions or basil or cilantro. Well, basil is a little longer lived, or cilantro that are low growing and don't require full sun, so they can be in a little bit of shade. And there are other good intercropping combos that you'll see in the description of that intercropping lesson. So the third way that you can save space is by choosing the bush varieties of different kinds of crops. So this is more like if you don't have the space to grow something like pumpkins or winter squash or watermelon, but you want to anyway. So those kinds of crops tend to spread out, sprawl out, and take up a large area. And if you have, a little backyard garden or a patio garden, or you're growing in containers, you're not going to have the space for a full-size sprawling variety of winter squash, like a blue Hubbard, or even a butternut. But there are varieties of those kinds of vegetables that have been grown for a smaller, more compact bush habit. And we'll put a list in the description below this lesson of some of those varieties that tend to be tasty and do very well, and just keep themselves a little bit more contained, so that if you're working with limited space, it doesn't mean you have to just forego growing things like watermelons or butternut squash. You just have to choose the varieties that are going to thrive in that limited space, rather than trying to pack something in to an area that's not big enough for it to have its full growth experience. The final thing that I'm going to talk about is fertility. And we've talked about this a lot, and we will continue to talk about it a lot because it's so crucially important to gardening. So fertility in the soil is what allows plants to grow and thrive. And if your soil has low fertility and you pack in a lot of different things in a small space, they're going to be competing with each other for finite limited resources. There's not going to be enough to go around. Versus if you really bolster fertility, you have the capacity to put in inputs like composted animal manure, like maybe to fertigate with liquid fish emulsion, different kinds of rich amendments that you can add into the soil. Or you're gardening in the same place and you can really work with cover crops and mulches and build and bolster the fertility in the soil. You're going to be able to grow more plants per area successfully with higher fertility than with lower fertility. Now, like with everything that we've been talking about in this class, one is not better or worse. You may not have the time, energy, or resources to really intensively manage a small plot like that and bolster the fertility. And in that case, it doesn't make sense to really densely plant everything. But if you do, let's say you have, a goat or a pet rabbit, and you have that manure source and you can bring it in, and you can really build up the soil. Or you have access to compost, you make it yourself, or you have somebody nearby who makes it, who you can trade or buy it from, then that can be a way to more intensively utilize a small space and get more out of a small space than if you weren't putting those inputs. So those are the 4 methods for saving space and sort of maximizing yield in a small space garden. And I hope whatever size you have to work with, you balance those factors, work with the vertical space, choose varieties that are appropriate for your condition, whether that be a bush variety or a more sprawling variety. Acknowledge the fertility and the fertility management that you're capable of doing and plant accordingly, and play around with intercropping in whatever way works well in your system. And I hope you have great success with these techniques.